The news spread through the streets like fire. The body of a young student who had gone missing during a protest for democracy was discovered several days later, floating in the ocean with remnants of a grenade in his left eye. The citizens were enraged at the government's use of violence in subduing protests. 2 days later, the citizens spilled out onto the streets and called for an end to dictatorship, corruption, and power abuse. That day left a legacy in Korean history as one of the first massive struggles that eventually democratized the country by the power of the citizens. The media is a catalyst for change. In many ways, the media has shaped the society that we live in now, but the role of the media has been especially large in democratization. Recently, social media has played an important role in the protests of Iran and Egypt, informing people about when and where to convene. The media not only informs, but also sparks interest, anger, and passion by casting a light upon events that remain otherwise unnoticed. It exposes the faults of governments and turns our attention to injustice, creating a start for revolution, reaction, and reform. In the light of current democracy movements, the history of South Korea sets an example of a successful shift from dictatorship to democracy. Certainly, in the mid to late 20th century, things weren't as they are now. There were many more obstacles which prevented a free press from existing. However, same as today, many events from the process of democratization were affected by the media, events which occurred either because of or in spite of it. Through trial and error, the media has developed alongside democracy. Here we present a case study on how the media has affected Korean democratization.
After the Korean War, the chaotic situation in South Korea led to a series of dictatorships. Syngman Rhee was the first of these dictators. As the first president of South Korea, his prolonged rule of over a decade was made possible by rigged elections, which eventually provoked citizens. What further aggravated public sentiment was the Kim Joo-yeol incident, in which the corpse of a student protester was discovered with signs of torture. When this news spread throughout Korea, it became the trigger to widespread action. Mass protests broke out all across Seoul and neighboring cities on April 19th of 1960 and led to the president stepping down from power. Up to that point, media was limited mostly to newspapers and handmade brochures. Its role in democratization was limited, and so were the democratization movements in general. They had mostly been initiated by students in relatively small-scale protests on college campuses, but the news of a life cruelly taken away by the government pushed the people to take action, which thus forced the president out of office in the April of 1960. After he officially stepped down from power, a transitional government was established. However, the fight for democracy did not end so easily. Through a military coup in the 70s, Park Chung-hee came to power and turned back the clock of democracy. He distorted the constitution to facilitate power abuse and kept a strong military rule on the people, while also limiting the freedom of press for over a decade. After his assassination in 1978, Chun Doo-hwan led yet another coup d'etat, worsening the regime of oppression. During these times, the tension escalated as troops were dispatched across the nation to control civilians. On May 18th of 1980, the people of Gwangju, a city in the southwest of Korea, and at the time a center for democratic movements, stood up against the military in Gwangju democratization movement. The military, having been especially strict in the region, suppressed protests with violence and isolated the region so as to block the news from spreading, as well as to punish the participating citizens. During the protests, which continued throughout the following days, citizens proceeded towards a broadcasting company and set it on fire, displaying their anger at the media, which was heavily influenced by the government. Ironically, the response of the government was to suppress the media and to prevent accurate news of the protests from reaching other Koreans. Broadcasting stations and newspapers were forced to cooperate with the government's propaganda. They portrayed the protests as the Gwangju crisis, in which spies had encroached upon the citizens and created a riot. In doing so, the government effectively prevented further large-scale protests, which was made possible by the limited and easily controllable media of the time. Foreign press took the lead in accurately delivering democratic movements and the signs of change that they were bringing to Korea. Although it ended in failure, the movement in Gwangju made way for the expanded protests which continued throughout the rule of Chun Do-hwan. In the following years, there were many events and policies enacted by the government which built up the pressure against democracy through the media and ultimately led to the June democracy movement. Protesters in Korea began to realize the importance of a free press and started creating civilian newspapers for the purpose of uniting citizens and fighting against oppression. Meanwhile, the government, feeling threatened more than ever, started enacting policies to control the media. Propaganda dominated television. Events such as the president's daughter's marriage were broadcasted and used as opportunities to uplift and praise the president. Meanwhile, the government endorsed recreation, heavily investing in the 3S policy of screen, sports, and sex, in order to turn public attention away from politics. In fact, this marked the start of Korean professional baseball, a tradition that continues to this day. Broadcasters were helpless against the authority of the government, but in some cases even voluntarily undertook the role of the government's megaphone. But the people did not entirely lose the ability to question and fight for their rights. The call for democracy actually intensified under suppression. First, it was the newspaper companies that stood up. Brave reporters revealed the guidelines that the government had sent to them daily. Citizens were appalled at the meticulous instructions that were given to the reporters. This word instead of that, 2 lines, no pictures, not too big, or with emphasis, easy to see. On the first page, in a box of 5 by 6 centimeters. It turned out that even the smallest details were controlled by the government. Most notably, the guidelines of the government had censored out recent news of democratization movements, which were going on simultaneously in the Philippines. As the people of Korea had been placing their hopes on their counterparts in the southeast, the Korean government blocked out any good news, worried that it would boost the Korean people's morale. As the press became increasingly freer, citizens became exposed to the brutality of the government. In the January of 1987, the news of a student protester's death once again reached the ears of the citizens. It was not just the death of the student, but also the government's poor attempt to hide the use of torture that became news. First declared to have died of shock, a brave few of the doctors who had managed the case later spoke up and attributed his death to torture. Those who heard this news in their homes were angered and lost trust in the government, leading to public rallies in remembrance of the student. The people shared the same sense of loss, as if they had lost their own brothers and sons, and the same anger towards the dictatorship. The press became even freer as the government lost its ability to keep total control, and as the citizens demanded more and more from the newspaper and broadcasting companies. At last, 동아일보, a Korean newspaper, instructed its newswriters to write all confirmed facts. This led to unprecedentedly extensive coverage of torture and violence issued by the government, with as much as 5 pages in each issue on the topic, complete with pictures and illustrations. This pledge of truthful reporting was partly because of the readers' continued demand for the truth, and also because of the consciences of reporters who had cooperated with the abusive government for a long time. Meanwhile, those companies that continued to comply with the government faced the harsh criticism of the public. KBS, a broadcasting network, was criticized for distorting facts and broadcasting propaganda. Their 9 o'clock news was satirized for always starting with the words, President Chun. A boycott against KBS was initially launched by farmers. In the course of a conflict between farmers' organizations and the government, KBS reported in a way that was untruthful and accused the farmers of wrongdoing. This movement spread across other parts of the nation, reaching women's organizations, and later the public in general. People refused to pay subscription fees to KBS and held public demonstrations. All these events, closely tied in with the media and the public's right to know, built up to yet another revolution. Finally, when the president announced his successor, the citizens burst out at the outright denial of democracy and organized protests involving 1.5 million people in over 16 cities. During the following days, large-scale protests happened all at once, all over the nation, to the likes of which had not been seen before. Eventually, the government issued the June 29th declaration, promising to amend the constitution and release Kim Dae-jung, a notable prisoner of conscience. After the end of authoritarianism, the power shifted gradually towards democratic leaders and governments. The media, as well as Korean society in general, has overcome countless obstacles toward becoming liberalized and unaffected by authority. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, South Korea has been ranked in recent years as a full democracy, highest in their scale of democracy.